The Siege of Vraks. Warhammer 40k is packed with epic conflicts, but only a handful of them have truly become a legend. Among them, the Siege of Vraks stands out as one of the longest and bloodiest wars in the history of the Imperium. This conflict was ignited by apostate Cardinal Astra Zaffin, a high-ranking official of the Adeptus Ministorum, the Imperial Church. As a corrupted preacher, he seized the armory world of Vraks, where he rallied the workers by preaching against the heretics and promising hope to the oppressed. When the Inquisition moved to silence him with an assassin, their plan failed. Zaffin survived the attempt and became a symbol of rebellion, igniting a full-blown revolt among the people. Now that Vrax's vast stockpiles of weapons have fallen into traitor hands, the Imperium went for a massive reclamation force. They sent in the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, consisting of 31 regiments from the Death Corps of Krieg. Masters of trench warfare, they embarked on what would become a grueling 17-year battle. The war mirrored the Great Wars of Old Earth, complete with artillery, poison gas, minefields, and millions of soldiers charging across no man's land into a hail of barbed wire and gunfire. To make matters worse, the Cardinal had secretly turned to Chaos, and his followers included traitor guardsmen, heretics, and eventually Chaos Space Marines. As the fighting dragged on, more and more Chaos forces converged on Vraks, transforming it into a hellish landscape of trench warfare and warp rifts, unleashing terrors across the battlefield. The Dark Angels and Red Scorpions joined the fray, clashing with Chaos champions like Jufor the Skulltaker and banishing greater demons such as Angrath the Bloodthirster. The turning point came when the war escalated into the unthinkable. Hordes of demons were unleashed on the front lines, and the Imperium countered with Titan Legions, Baneblades, and eventually the Grey Knights. 17 bloody years later, the Cardinal was killed, and the planet was declared secure. But by then, Vraks was nothing but a toxic wasteland and corpse world. The skies turned black with smoke, and the war had consumed millions of lives that victory hardly seemed like a win. The First Tyrannic War. This marked humanity's first real clash with the Tyranids, and it all kicked off with Hive Fleet Behemoth. This terrifying swarm emerged from the dark void beyond the galactic rim, launching an attack on the eastern fringe with a speed and hunger that the Imperium had never encountered before. Entire star systems were stripped of life in no time, and by the time the Imperium grasped the gravity of the situation, Behemoth was already bearing down on Ultramar. The conflict primarily pitted the Ultramarines against Behemoth. The chapter's homeworlds became the front line, with the most legendary battle unfolding on Macragge itself. The Tyranids unleashed a colossal planetary assault, crashing their bioships into the surface with waves of monstrous creatures. For the Ultramarines, it was a fight for survival. The fortress garrisons held their ground until the very end, and when reinforcements finally arrived, they were met with a grim sight, walls heaped with the bodies of both humans and Xenos. Almost the entire First Company was wiped out. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, fought a desperate defense both in space and on the ground, holding his chapter together in the face of extinction. The Tyranids, of course, had no single leader, only the terrifying collective will of the hive mind, directing every creature with perfect coordination. The war finally ended when the combined Imperial Navy and Ultramarines managed to smash Behemoth's main hive ships in orbit around Macragge. Without their command organisms, the swarm collapsed, but the cost was staggering. Though the Imperium declared victory, it felt more like a hollow triumph. The First Tyrannic War left Ultramar deeply scarred, its finest warriors fallen, and left the Imperium with the grim realization that this was just the beginning. The War of Octarius. If the First Tyrannic War opened the galaxy's eyes to the horrors of the Tyranids, the War of Octarius made it clear that the nightmare was far from over. New tendrils of Tyranid swarms slithered into the galaxy, and one of them was Hive Fleet Leviathan. The Empire of Octarius sector was already a boiling pot of chaos before the Tyranids arrived. It was a sprawling orc domain ruled by the Overfiend of Octarius, who held together dozens of rival clans. His enemies, like the brutal warlords of Gork's Teeth and Skullsmash's Boys, fought each other as much as they fought outsiders, and every world in the sector burned with constant battles. With this in mind, Inquisitor Kryptman, an expert on Tyranids, realized Hive Fleet Leviathan was bearing down on the galaxy and couldn't be stopped by normal means. Instead of fighting it head-on, he lured a massive Tyranid swarm into orc space. His logic was simple. If anything could stop the Tyranids, it would be the orcs' love for fighting. The results were exactly as brutal as you'd imagine. Tyranids and orcs clashed on every planet, in every jungle, and in orbit above Octarius itself. The orcs charged into battle in droves, laughing as they were ripped apart, while the Tyranids adapted, evolving bigger, nastier biomonsters to match. Because of their reproductive methods, both Xeno species became stronger and more numerous as they fought, and it was clear that whichever faction would win the War of Octarius would become unstoppable. This is when other factions took notice, and Eldari seers warned that Kryptman's gamble had unleashed a beast that could never be tamed. They attempted to limit this threat, while the Space Marines also launched raids to incinerate Tyranid nests or cripple orc war machines, but their efforts barely made a dent. Each intervention only added more bodies to the carnage. In the end, the Swarmlord launched a colossal assault that devoured the major worlds of the sector, but the orcs are far from defeated. Kryptman was exiled for his crime, and the Imperium is now left to watch two unstoppable forces strengthen themselves in an eternal meat grinder. The First War for Armageddon. This war is rarely mentioned, and that's because the Inquisition has buried the truth. The First War for Armageddon was sparked by the forces of chaos and masterminded by Angren, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, who wanted to reunite his broken legion and set them loose on the Imperium. The invasion kicked off with uprisings throughout the hives of Armageddon Prime, but the real nightmare began with the arrival of the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars. From its depths surged the World Eaters and their allies, with half of the planet's defenders turning traitor on the spot. Hive cities crumbled in mere days, and millions of civilians were slaughtered. Angren's warbands erected monuments of skulls, transforming the planet into a shrine dedicated to Khorne. Armageddon's armies retreated, barely managing to slow the tide. Reinforcements arrived in the form of the Space Wolves, led by Logan Grimnar, but even the elites found it hard to stop the bloodshed. At the peak of the war, Angren took charge and led the assault. His rampage tore through entire regiments, and no mortal force could hold him back. In a last-ditch effort, the Grey Knights sent a full brotherhood of over 100 Terminators straight into his ranks. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal in Imperial history. Despite being anti-demon specialists, Angren still ripped through most of the Grey Knight warriors, but their sacrifice was just enough to push him back into the warp. The Imperium declared victory, but the aftermath was grim, as countless civilians died not just from chaos, but from the Imperium's own actions. The Inquisition got rid of every surviving guardsman to erase every chance of chaos taint. This triggered an internal conflict between the Grey Knights and the Space Wolves, who didn't accept the murder of those that fought chaos alongside them. In addition, the conflicts on Armageddon were far from over, as two more devastating wars would target the planet in the following years. The Badab War. Fought between the Astroclaws and their allies against loyalist space marines, the Badab War was one of the bloodiest civil wars in Imperial history. At the heart of this chaos was Luft Huron, the chapter master of the Astroclaws, who boldly declared independence and crowned himself the Tyrant of Badab. It all started when Huron decided to withhold the Imperium's dues, hoarding resources to fuel his own ambitions. When Imperial forces attempted to investigate, they mysteriously disappeared. Soon war erupted, and Huron's secessionist chapters transformed Badab, a region located within the Maelstrom Zone, into a heavily fortified stronghold complete with orbital defenses and lethal ambush points. The Imperium retaliated by dispatching loyalist chapters like the Salamanders and Red Scorpions, hell-bent on taking down the tyrant. In the depths of space, boarding actions turned starships into gruesome slaughterhouses, with power-armored warriors clashing in blood-soaked corridors. On the ground, planetary invasions resulted in entire cities being turned into wastelands. On Badab itself, the Astroclaws fought with the ferocity of cornered beasts, leaving piles of loyalist corpses behind every barricade. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire, and millions suffered under the siege warfare. After 11 years of non-stop violence, the war finally came to a close when loyalist marines breached Badab's defenses. Huron was left horrifically injured, losing half his body to meltifire, yet he managed to escape into the Maelstrom with a small band of followers. While the Imperium declared victory, tens of thousands of space marines lay dead, and countless Imperial guardsmen and civilians lost their lives. The Damocles Gulf Crusade. This marked the Imperium's first major clash with the Tau Empire, and the Damocles Gulf Crusade was nothing short of a massacre from beginning to end. It all kicked off when Imperial worlds near the Gulf started trading with the Tau and got seduced by their promises of advanced technology and a brighter future. The Inquisition called it heresy, Cardinal Esau Gurney demanded blood, and soon a massive crusade fleet was launched to burn the aliens out of existence. Initially, Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marines unleashed their fury on Tau colonies. Droves of Tau were annihilated, and civilians were burned alive in their homes, while hammerhead tanks and battle suits were ripped apart in the streets. The Imperium forces bombarded entire planets from orbit and intentionally melted their ice caps, drowning their inhabitants in scalding oceans, a true act of genocide. However, when the Crusade fleet finally arrived, the Tau retaliated with equal brutality. A massive space battle followed, destroying 4 Imperial capital ships and escorts, while Kroot warspheres crashed into Navy formations, turning void ships into tombs. Titans stomped through forests and mountains, but they found out how easily Tau railguns can punch straight through their armor. Guard regiments were shredded by ambushes from Kroot packs that tore men apart with claws and teeth, leaving corpses hanging from trees as warnings. Space Marines charged headfirst into crisis battlesuits, resulting in a gruesome display of torn limbs and armor across the mud. The carnage continued for months, with both sides bleeding themselves dry. It was only the impending arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth that forced the Imperium to retreat. General Gage evacuated under fire, while the Tau Watercast swiftly proposed peace talks. Both sides claimed victory in a stalemate, but the reality was clear. The Tau discovered just how brutal humanity could be, and the Imperium learned that the Tau weren't as weak as they thought. The Plague Wars. The Plague Wars erupted when Mortarion, the demon primarch of the Death Guard, unleashed the full force of Nurgle's Plague Legions on Ultramar, a sinister plot designed to annex Guilliman's realm into Nurgle's garden. Mortarion's fleets launched assaults on Ultramar's defenses, while Typhus wreaked havoc on the star forts that protected its shipping routes. They were also supported by the great Unclean One Kugath and his host of demons. The invasion kicked off with a surge of corruption. The Death Guard's force wasn't large enough to attack Macragge directly, so Mortarion focused on minor planets and tainted them with his plague engines, raising the dead as stumbling hordes of zombies that joined his army. The demons flooded the lush world of Ixax through a group of tainted guardsmen, turning it into a breeding ground for Nurgle's contagions. This would eventually become one of the main battlefields of the Plague Wars. On Parmenio, Imperial forces struggled to defend the few potable rivers against Mortarion's legions, but even the waters turned against them. The Death Guard poisoned the currents, causing entire regiments to vomit themselves to death after just one sip. Finally, Guilliman arrived and led the Ultramarines and their Primaris reinforcements in a desperate counterattack. The battles intensified into massive armored confrontations on Parmenio and eventually led to Ixax, where Guilliman found himself in a duel with his corrupted brother. Mortarion nearly finished him off with the Godblight Plague, a biological weapon crafted to take down even a Primarch. On the brink of death, Guilliman was infused with the Emperor's light, empowering him to strike back with divine force that terrified his corrupted brother and burned through Nurgle's garden. Mortarion was forced to retreat by a displeased Nurgle, and Ixax was purged with Exterminatus to prevent it from falling into Chaos's hands. The Imperium counted it as a victory, but Ultramar was left scarred, and millions were reduced to ash or rotting corpses. The Plague Wars showed that even with Guilliman's return, the Age of Chaos was far from over. The fall of Cadia. For 10,000 years, Cadia was the Imperium's defense, with its fortress cities and endless waves of shock troops guarding the Eye of Terror and serving as a gatekeeper to keep chaos from spilling freely into the galaxy. Generations of Cadians lived and died knowing their world was the shield of mankind. That shield finally broke with Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. When he arrived at the head of the largest Chaos Armada, the ultimate war for Cadia began. His flagship Planet Killer and the demon ship Terminus Est led the charge, while his throne was set aboard the Will of Eternity, a captured Blackstone fortress that leveled entire battle stations in a single shot. On the ground, Cadia turned into a graveyard. Cornate berserkers under Urkrathos slaughtered defenders by the tens of thousands, raising the fallen as thralls to fight once more. The Sisters of Battle fell in waves as they defended their sacred shrines. Space Wolves and Black Templars bled in the streets of Kassercraft, while the Dark Angels engaged in desperate boarding actions in orbit. Even Saint Celestine descended to rally the remaining survivors. Abaddon's forces aimed to destroy the pylons, ancient structures that kept the Eye of Terror expansion in check. As they fell, Cadia's doom was sealed, and in the war's final act, Abaddon hurled the Will of Eternity into the planet, shattering its crust, boiling away oceans, and ultimately destroying the planet. The Imperium's leaders managed to escape with only a fraction of the defenders, and the Eye of Terror erupted outward into the galaxy and expanded as the Great Rift. The fall of Cadia marked the day the galaxy itself was torn in half. This concludes our rundown of the most brutal wars in Warhammer 40k. Let me know in the comments if you know any other stories like these, and click here to check out another video.